This is a Parks Canada production. Ce balado est aussi disponible en français.
December 1565. A galleon called the San Juan sits at anchor. The ship is in a harbour known to a generation of Basque whalers as buttes. The sailors have filled the hold with nearly 1,000 barrels of valuable cargo, but the southern coast of Labrador is notorious for its fierce northwesterly winds. Despite their efforts, they lose control and the ship smashes into the rocks. Into the dark, churning waters goes the product of a summer of dangerous, back-breaking work. For more than 400 years, the San Juan and its story lie forgotten, just 10 meters beneath the surface, a hidden remnant of a bustling whaling enterprise that once lit the lamps of Europe. I'm Fred Shepard, and you're listening to ReCollections, Discovering the Basque Whalers of Terra Nova. Parks Canada is known worldwide as a leader in nature conservation, but we do much more than that. Together with our partners, we commemorate the people, places, and events that have shaped the place we now call Canada. Join us to meet experts from across the country as we explore the sites, stories, and artifacts that bring history to life. (1972), Burgos, Spain. British-Canadian historian and geographer Selma Barkham is in a provincial archive near the Basque Country, searching for evidence of a centuries-old connection to North America. Selma has been preparing for this research for many years, learning Spanish and moving her 4 children to a new continent. No easy feat for a single mother in the 60s and 70s. All of that effort is finally paying off. She's finding 16th century documents with names of ports that aren't in the Basque Country or on modern maps at all. She's also coming across decades worth of records showing hundreds of galleons shipping cargo to Europe from a dozen overseas ports, each packed full with barrels of grasa de ballena, whale oil. It's beginning to look like these ports along the Grand Bahia of Terra Nova, now the southern coast of Labrador, were the heart of a major business enterprise.
This whaling industry really just hit her in the face. It jumped out at her from all these documents that she was finding. She didn't expect to discover a full-scale whaling industry in Atlantic Canada before the foundation of modern Canada.
In this episode, we're looking at Red Bay National Historic Site on the southern coast of Labrador, a site that UNESCO calls the earliest, most complete, and best preserved testimony of the European whaling tradition. We're exploring the dangerous labors of the Basque men who chased whales and how dedicated researchers worked to reveal the story in the 1970s and 80s.
It's at Red Bay where we have a sense of the breadth of colonial enterprise along the northeastern seaboard. This was an enormous enterprise. The vastness of it, the numbers of vessels, the thousands of men who came every year.
But first, what were the Basque doing in coastal Labrador in the first place? It all began with the cod. To learn more, we spoke with Dr. Michael Barkham, historian and geographer.
In 1497, the Venetian John Cabot, or Giovanni Caboto, sailed across the Atlantic in search of Asia. Instead, he found a land where he said there was so much codfish you could actually catch it with baskets. Within 15, 20 years, believe it or not, European fishermen, some French, some Portuguese, some Spaniards, some Basques, had already started or established a small European cod fisheries along the Atlantic coast of Canada. What happens is that the Basques not only see cod and catch cod, but they start seeing whales.
And unlike the other European fishermen, the Basque had experience with hunting whales commercially. They were skilled shipwrights, masterful fishermen, adventurous seafarers, and experienced merchants. Their homeland, the Basque Country, is a mountainous region on the Atlantic coast of Europe with parts in both France and Spain.
Before they crossed the Atlantic, they were whalers off of the Bay of Biscay.
This is Dr. Marianne Stopp, who retired from Parks Canada in 2023. We heard from her a little earlier.
I've been working as an archaeologist and an historian in the area of Labrador history and prehistory for many decades.
Marianne worked as an underwater archaeologist at Red Bay in the early 1980s. She was among the earliest women in Canada to do that job.
They already had a long tradition of venturing out into open waters after large mammals and fish.
Intrigued by reports of vast whale populations in Terra Nova, now the Atlantic coast of Canada, Basque merchants and mariners sensed a golden opportunity.
And that whaling industry grows. It reaches its peak between 1560 and 1585, which is a 25-year period, a quarter of a century, when there were about 25 or 30 large galleons going annually to hunt whales, with perhaps 2,000 men and boys on board, and occupying some 12 ports along the south coast of Labrador and Quebec, and hunting or killing up to about 400 whales, which translated to about 20,000 barrels of whale oil.
That product was used basically for lighting Europe, churches, larger municipal buildings.
In the years before electricity, whale oil lamps were very important. The oil had other uses as well.
It was a product that came to be needed to keep the machinery of a developing Europe in place and moving.
Whale oil was used to lubricate that machinery and also help with processing wool. Baleen, the bristly food-catching filter inside the whale's mouth, was used in European fashion, like the farthingale sleeve, where it gave body to the puffy sleeves of 16th century outfits. Think of the portraits of Queen Elizabeth I and others in Shakespearean England. But primarily, the whale oil enterprise was all about bringing light to the lamps of Europe.
The oil was very valuable. It's on par with today's oil industry.
It's hard to put a current dollar amount on this industry, but whale oil was clearly valuable enough that thousands of Basque men braved the harsh North Atlantic each year to go get it.
These were not people plucked off the street and forced to go into the whaling industry. These were people invested in making a profit.
There was a real incentive to work hard. Everyone involved, the crew, the galleon owners, and the outfitters, earned a cut of the proceeds. The more oil that made it back to Europe, the more everyone stood to profit. The Basque shipped their bounty in galleons, large wooden, multi-decked sailing ships.
These Basque whaling vessels are so important. They were like the Ford F-150s that we have on the road versus Cadillacs. They were not fancy vessels.
In Terra Nova, the galleons doubled as floating warehouses and sleeping quarters. They needed to be moored somewhere safe during the whaling season, usually from June to late autumn, when the coastal waters were free of ice. Red Bay was ideal. Red Bay is a natural harbour that cuts into the coastline of southern Labrador. It's protected by nearby Saddle Island, a treeless, kilometre-wide rocky outcrop about 300 metres off the mainland.
It's a very sheltered harbour, and I think that's one of the reasons why it played such a key role in the whaling industry and in other fisheries over the years.
This is Cindy Gibbons, Cultural Resource Management Advisor for Red Bay National Historic Site.
I grew up in Red Bay. I have worked with the Basque whaling site there since I was in high school. There's also an inner harbour, which gives really good shelter, especially in high winds, and we call it the basin locally. Those two features make it a really good harbour for ships, for fishing, for any maritime activity, really.
The natural protected harbour has been a draw for a very long time.
Since about 6,000 years ago, we have evidence of people being on Saddle Island and also on the mainland portion of Red Bay. And every single culture group that has ever spent time in Labrador has a presence in Red Bay, as they have in so many of the other harbours in southern Labrador. We have the archaic peoples, we have intermediate early First Nations groups. The Dorset, Grosswater sites are found in that region. Later Inuit sites are found in the Red Bay Harbour area. There are many fire pits on Saddle Island itself that appear to date to later First Nations presence.
Despite this archaeological evidence, much of it discovered while excavating Basque sites, what we don't have is firm evidence of any direct contact between indigenous peoples and the Basque at Red Bay. However, some European documents recount stories of contacts between the Basque and indigenous peoples in other parts of the region around this time period. It was a complicated relationship. There are references to trade between the groups and the emergence of simplified trade language to communicate. There are also references to violent interactions. Above the waterline, Red Bay is rocky, a mostly treeless shoreline, with bogs, low hills, and red rocks peppered with rusty lichen.
The landscape around Red Bay today is a fairly barren landscape.
French explorer Jacques Cartier also noted the lack of vegetation, describing the region in 1534 as the land God gave to Cain. Along the whole of the shore, I did not see one cartload of earth. But beneath the ocean's surface is a bustling marine ecosystem with fish like cod, herring, and capelin, seasonally home to seals, porpoises, dolphins, and whales. Gulls, cormorants, and eider ducks fly by, and occasionally polar bears come ashore.
The Basque were drawn to Red Bay. They were actually drawn to many places along the southeastern coast of Labrador because they gave easy access to the open waters of the Strait of Belle Isle, where the whales passed up and down.
The Strait of Belle Isle, or as the whalers called it, Grand Baia, the Grand Bay. The body of water that separates Labrador to the north from the island of Newfoundland to the south. You might remember this region from our episode on Lanza Meadows, the only confirmed Viking Age Norse settlement in North America. It's across the strait, on the Newfoundland side. Up to 100 icebergs, calved from glaciers in Greenland, drift into the strait each spring and summer. But spotting icebergs was not the main focus of the whalers manning the lookouts on Saddle Island. Their eyes were peeled for signs of migrating right whales and bowhead whales. They were an ideal catch. Both species are relatively slow-moving baleen whales with plenty of fatty tissue called blubber to render, or liquefy, into oil. And they usually floated to the surface when killed.
The hunting was not done from the larger galleon. It was done from this small, close to the water, low freeboard vessel that would have men rowing it with the weapons needed to kill these whales.
They called these smaller vessels chalupas, a sturdy and adaptable boat that could be rowed or equipped with sails.
Thousands of whales were killed at this time from these tiny vessels.
Chalupas were about 8 meters long and 2 meters wide, much smaller than the 13 to 20 meter whales they hunted. The vessels were sturdy, but could still be capsized by the whales, something that's quite evident from a grave discovered on Saddle Island containing the remains of 7 men. The crew of a chalupa, not coincidentally, was often 7, including at least one harpooner to target the whale.
These were tough guys, and they would position themselves at the bow of the boat and throw the harpoon into the whale.
Their methods were part of the Basque tradition of whale hunting.
During the Middle Ages, they developed the techniques of how to catch these huge, monstrous animals in the sea. And the Basques gradually developed the technique that we think of when we read Moby Dick, which is a harpoon tied to a rope that is then tied to a small whaleboat.
French explorer Samuel de Champlain witnessed a Basque whale hunt in Terra Nova in 1610, writing,
"As soon as the harpooner sees his chance, he throws his harpoon, which penetrates very deeply into the whale. Directly the whale feels itself wounded. It goes to the bottom, and if by chance in turning it strikes with its tail the chalupa or the men, it crushes them as easily as a tumbler. It sometimes drags the chalupa some 8 or 9 leagues, traveling as fast as a horse.
And when it comes up for air, you harpoon it again."
Because the more wounds in the whale, the faster it became weak enough to approach and kill.
And then eventually, you just lance it and bleed the whale to death.
And then a rope was attached to the tail so that it could be pulled back. They would sometimes join together several chalupas and crews to tow a whale back to port.
even though the whale carcass floated, this likely took many hours. Once back on shore, they would get to work on removing the blubber.
They would slice off the fat with huge flensing knives, which are probably about a foot-long blade. So the blubber strips was cut up into sort of manageable sizes and taken on shore.
To this day, discarded whale bones from this time period line the beach known as the Bony Shore. Next came the process of rendering the blubber into oil.
One of the main structures that Basque whalers were building at every one of their stations were these try-works, these places where large cauldrons could be set into stone foundations, fires built under them.
The foundations were simple masonry, about 1 meter high, made from local stone and clay from the Basque country. The copper cauldrons were also brought over from Europe and could render about 170 liters of whale oil. These try-works, or rendering ovens, also kept the people stirring the cauldrons out of the elements.
The rendering ovens were built very close to the shore, as close as was practical with the high tides.
And over these units would be a roof of some sort so that they could continue working through all weather. And those roofs were covered by a very European-looking red roof tile.
Those red roof tiles would prove, centuries later, to be extremely important to Selma Barkham's discovery of the whaling industry in the Strait of Belle Isle. Once the oil was liquefied,
it was kind of ladled into vats that were half filled with fresh water, and then the oil would float on top of the water, and any impurities or dirt would settle down into the water, and then the oil was skimmed off the top and ladled into barrels.
The wooden barrels were carefully assembled by skilled coopers to prevent any leaks. Archaeologists have found remnants of their workshops on Saddle Island.
And then the barrels were sealed, and the oil was light enough that the barrels could be floated out to the ship.
Picture a typical summer's day in Buttes, as the Basque called Red Bay, with crisp winds coming off the water, a lingering fog bank in the distance, and swarms of black flies hovering overhead. It's an intense hub of activity for hundreds of men, butchering whales, assembling barrels, and transporting blubber to the rendering ovens. Imagine the smell for those stirring the greasy cauldrons, smoke mixing with rendering oil, adding to the lingering aroma of discarded whale carcasses decaying in the briny waters nearby. Quite the sensory overload. When a galleon's hold was full, with up to 2,000 barrels of whale oil, the crew could celebrate a successful season and set sail for European trading ports.
They were trying to get as much whale oil as they could in the ship before weather forced them to go back to Europe.
The harsh Labrador winter was well worth avoiding. In the 1540s, the early years of the Grand Bay whale fishery, the Basque could fill a galleon's hold during the relatively mild months of June to September. But as time went on, the risk of getting caught in winter's grip increased as they started staying longer into the fall, due in part to a declining number of summer whales.
The resource waned. They had been fishing thousands of whales, and that population was probably impacted.
And at some point, they realized that there was another population that migrated south through the Strait of Belle Isle in the fall, beginning in October. And that's what kept them there later. So eventually the focus shifted to that fall hunt.
But even that population was finite.
By the 1580s, really the whalers are beginning to realize that there are less and less whales because the documents talk, first of all, of some ships coming back no longer full, whereas in the 1560s and 70s, they were expected to make a full cargo.
The profit incentive pushed crews to make risky decisions about how long to stay. Some didn't make it out in time.
The first known overwintering occurred in the winter of 76 to 77, when, according to contemporary accounts, several hundred of the best and strongest whalers were caught in the slush.
And the water coagulated, it says, cuajó, so we couldn't get our ship out.
The harbors became choked with ice and frozen before a lot of the ships could leave because they had stayed so late to get as much oil as they could.
Crews forced to overwinter were unprepared for survival on the bleak coast, and many died. One unlucky whaler, Juan Martinez de la Rume, dictated his will in the harbour of Buttes on June 22nd, 1577. It's one of the oldest known wills written in North America.
Vintei nomine amen. Jakin beza testamentuta azkeneko borondateko dokumentua irakurtzen duen orok, nola ni, oriokoa naizen, Larrumeko Juan Martinez, oean gaixo...
In his will, Larume requested funeral rites at his family's tomb, even if death occurred far from the Basque country, which it did. He seems to have survived the worst of the freezing winter, only to die as a new whaling season began. Between the dwindling number of whales and geopolitical factors like the Anglo-Spanish War forcing Basque galleons into naval service, the writing was on the wall for the industry.
Just as a sort of a nail in the coffin is a wonderful quote from 1613 from the province of Guipúzcoa to the king of Spain, saying that our sailors are finding the whale fishery of the Grand Bay of Terra very exhausted, which describes the situation quite clearly.
As profits dwindled, so did investors' interest in sending whaling crews across the Atlantic. The whale oil boom of Terra Nova went bust. Centuries passed. Red Bay Harbor and its access to fish and seals remained a draw for European and indigenous people. Beginning in the 1700s, first the French and later the English established seasonal bases of operations for cod fishing and fur trading. In the first half of the 1800s, fishers from Newfoundland established a community of year-round residents that remains to this day. But the story of the whale oil rush of the Grand Bahia of Terra Nova was lost in the mists of time until the 20th century, when Selma Barkham, the researcher we told you about earlier, moved to Canada.
In 1950, aged 23, she visited relatives in Canada and ended up settling in Montreal, where she eventually was appointed librarian of the Arctic Institute of North America at McGill University. So there in 1953, she met a young English architect, Brian Barkham, who funnily enough had already an affection for the Basque country. In 1954, Selma and Brian married, and 2 years later, 1956, they traveled to the Basque country to visit Brian's good friend, Don Pio, who mentioned, oh, did you know that there was an ancient Basque presence in Terra Nova, in Atlantic Canada? So that little idea, that little kernel stuck in Selma's head. However, in 1964, about 8 years later, tragedy struck in that Brian suddenly died. Selma, at the age of 37, was widowed with 4 young children under the age of 10.
If you haven't guessed it yet, historian Michael Barkham was one of them.
She ended up being hired as a historian by National Historic Sites of Canada. And that way, she participated in the reconstruction of Louisbourg.
You can hear more about Louisbourg in our Season 1 episode, Enslavement and Freedom at the French Fortress.
In the archival documentation on Louisbourg, she found that many of the French cod fishermen hailed from the Basque country, but it turned out very little was known about those voyages. But she decided that what she really wanted to do was to do her own research in the archives of France and Spain to try to uncover the almost unknown Basque expeditions to Canada during the 16th and 17th centuries.
That's how in 1969, barely 5 years after Brian, our father, had died, Selma moved us children to Mexico by car, the plan being to learn Spanish for her future archival work.
Then, in 1972, after 3 years of practicing Spanish, the family traveled by ocean liner to Bilbao, in the Basque region of Spain.
She taught English to make ends meet, and then suddenly, out of the blue, she received 1,000 Canadian dollars from an anonymous Canadian donor.
Her friend and former boss, Jack Richardson, had facilitated the donation. Here's Michael reading one of Selma's letters for us.
Dear Jack, your friend's miraculous trek has turned the tide. It is an absolutely fabulous amount to do here.
Michael recalled one memorable archive in the small Basque town of Oñati, run by a single priest.
Now people think, oh, an archive. You go in and you press a button and it says Terra Nova, and there's all sorts of people who bring you things. And no, this was just an old building with a whole bunch of old documents. You had to take your own lamp, and you could hear the termites eating away the wood, because it was wooden shelves with all these 16th and 17th century documents on them. And at night, if it was so silent, you could hear them munch, munch, munch.
Michael and his 3 siblings spent a lot of time there.
We've sat on the table copying these documents or looking for the word Terra Nova.
But it was in the provincial archives of Burgos where Selma had her first eureka moment, when she realized that a surprising number of the Basque expeditions were heading to Terra Nova not in search of codfish, but instead a much bigger catch: whales. What tipped her off was insurance documentation for ships and their cargo, and plenty of it. A testament to the savvy business practices in 16th century Spain.
Over the years, Selma researched in some 40 archives, mostly of the Iberian Peninsula, from Bilbao and Burgos to Madrid, Seville, and Lisbon. And gradually, she would uncover thousands of previously unknown manuscripts, including insurance policies, lawsuits, wills, crew agreements, list of provisions and equipment, etc., etc. She really never could have imagined so much documentation.
She also suspected there must be physical archaeological evidence out there, somewhere.
There had to be evidence. I mean, with all these 25, 30 whaling ships going to the Strait, to 10 to 12 ports along the coast, 2,000 men a year, 200 small whale boats, and maybe 400 whales a year, there just had to be remains of this industry.
She also had a hunch as to what type of evidence might be found.
The documents that she had read referred to the ships bringing thousands and thousands of roof tiles to Labrador every year.
These are red earthenware, unglazed, lengths of curved ceramic. They would have been brought in the ships and then used in Labrador as roof material for the various structures that the Basque built.
Structures like the rendering ovens.
There was no record of them going back. They were coming out on the ships with the supplies, but of course, going back, the ships were filled with oil. So anything like that would have been left behind. To her way of thinking, somewhere on the coast of Labrador, there were thousands and thousands of roof tiles from the Basque country.
After 5 years of gathering documentary evidence, Selma wanted to visit Terra Nova to search the landscape for physical signs of the Basque whalers.
She was using charts from the 16th century and place names from the documents and comparing it with modern day charts and place names. And she concluded that these whalers must have been coming to the Strait of Belle Isle, a place that they called the Grand Bay.
So backed by her research so far, she organized an archaeological survey expedition to southern Labrador with a grant from the Royal Canadian Geographical Society.
July 1977. Selma traveled to Labrador, hitching a ride along a dirt road near the Strait of Belle Isle.
She was a young woman with practically no money, just arriving in Labrador with a few documents in her hand and looking for a red roofing tile. It's the most amazing story.
But she wasn't traveling alone. Selma brought 2 of her teenagers along, including 18-year-old Michael.
And I do remember it was the summer Elvis Presley died.
Arctic researcher Graham Rowley and his family later joined the expedition. As it turned out, they didn't have to search for too long. The Barkham's first discovery came at West Saint-Maurice, a small coastal community not far from Red Bay.
We're surrounded by black flies, the wind is blowing, it's chilly up there. Rummaging through the cabbage patches by the fishing houses next to the water were pieces of red tile. Earthenware tile, which we immediately recognized because they still use them on Basque farmhouses. And there were some quite large pieces. They clearly weren't bricks, they were rounded in some sections. But it was an amazing sense, I think, for Selma. I can't really speak for her, but I can speak for myself as an 18-year-old who'd spent half of his life listening to the word Terra Nova and going in and out of archives already. It was just an amazing sense of, well, here it is. I mean, this is it. It's the proof.
The evidence became even more convincing with a find at a place called Schooner Cove. This time, the Barkhams were joined by a pair of archaeologists, Dr. Jim Tuck from Memorial University of Newfoundland and Dr. Robert McGee from the Archaeological Survey of Canada.
Selma had pinpointed was called Balea Baya, which was the Bay of the Whales. We again, just walking along the shores, looking at the erosion, I suddenly saw a piece of metal sticking out from the overhang. Jim did a quick excavation of that, and there, sure enough, was the tip of a harpoon. It was a harpoon in with tile, whale bones, baleen, and some of that black grimy blubber. You couldn't have asked for a better calling card. It's just lying there. I am a harpoon, and I am lying in amongst some tile and some baleen, just to make it easier for you.
These finds were just the first of many.
That summer, we explored several harbours along the south coast of Labrador and Quebec. And there, sure enough, Selma discovered archaeological remains of Basque whaling bases, including at Red Bay, which really confirmed all her historical work in Europe. So that really was the eureka moment.
After these finds on the shore, Selma shifted her focus to the water, searching for shipwrecks.
She found specifically a reference to 2 wrecking events that occurred in Chateau Bay and Red Bay. They weren't called that at the time, but she was able to, through her research, determine that those were the most likely areas. My name is Brandy Lockhart. I am an underwater archaeologist with Parks Canada, and I am currently the lead archaeologist for Red Bay. The documents described the cargo and stated that one of these in particular went down when it was already full of whale oil.
One of those wrecks was the San Juan, the galleon we told you about at the beginning of this episode.
The vessel had been fully loaded at the end of a whaling season in 1565 and was ready to sail home when a north wind struck.
There is a particular type of storm that hits the Strait of Belle Isle that is very dangerous. It comes in very quickly.
In studying the documents, Selma concluded that it should have been on the shores of Saddle Island, given the direction of the wind and where the ships would have been moored.
And so, in 1978, a year after the initial discoveries of Basque artifacts,
She requested that Parks Canada underwater archaeology team visit Red Bay.
the hunt for the San Juan began.
The underwater archaeology team came and did a survey in the bay to see if they could find any evidence of these wreck sites.
Part of the survey involved pulling a diver behind a boat on a towboard, scanning the ocean bottom.
It's like underwater water skiing.
After 3 days of searching, the team, led by Robert Grenier, found a shipwrecked galleon just off the coast of Saddle Island. Grenier later wrote in Canadian Geographic magazine, "Was it possible that 400-year-old remains could be located that easily, so quickly, and exactly where they were expected to be?"
On a very clear day, if the light is hitting the water in a certain way, you can actually see it from the surface. No bodies were found. No one died in this shipwreck. It wrecked in a storm very close to shore, and all of the men would have been able to get onto Saddle Island quickly. We call this vessel the presumed San Juan.
The presumed San Juan.
In archaeology, it's really a lot easier to determine that something is not what you are looking for. We don't have any evidence that says it's not the San Juan, so we presume that it is, but perhaps someday we might find evidence that says, oh, actually, there were 2 wrecks in there that were the exact same breadth and length and description.
These discoveries, both terrestrial and underwater, played a major role in Red Bay being recognized as a National Historic Site in 1979. For the next several summers, archaeologists from Memorial University, led by Dr. Jim Tuck, excavated terrestrial sites around Saddle Island and Red Bay. With the help of hired locals, they learned much about the whole operation by examining the remains of rendering ovens, cooperages, a lookout point, a cemetery, and more. Meanwhile, Parks Canada's underwater archaeology team excavated the presumed San Juan, eventually determining it to be the oldest European shipwreck found in North America north of Florida. Between 1978 and 1985, Parks Canada logged 14,000 dive hours in Red Bay's icy waters, fully excavating the wreck. By project's end, they had analyzed and documented 3,000 of the ship's timbers.
It was of huge interest to study how the ship had been built. You have to appreciate that at that point in time, no one had ever studied a 16th century vessel in detail. The construction of this vessel was hugely interesting for people, not just in Canada, but across the Atlantic as well.
We've used the term underwater archaeology many times now, So let's take a moment to discuss what archaeology underwater actually involves.
The main differences between underwater and terrestrial archaeology, I would say, are in just about every way. The way one has to approach the site is different. One is in diving gear, weighted down with tanks and weight belts. So there is a real danger of damaging the site with one's fins or by landing too hard. The methodology is slightly different. We're still mapping underwater, just as one does on land. But the pencils and the erasers and the paper, which all function quite well underwater, they do have to be held down so they don't float away. At Red Bay, we often had the unique, funny experience of seeing small fish, these quite ugly little fish called sculpins, come along and try to swallow our erasers. And that was always fun. But the erasers were tied down, so they didn't get away with much.
We also have specialized paper, waterproof paper, so that we can write our notes underwater the same as on land. One of the bigger challenges, though, with the underwater writing is that you're wearing gigantic gloves. Often, especially in Red Bay, we'll wear 3-fingered mitts. The temperatures in the water can be down to -2 degrees.
There were a number of new technologies that were in use on the underwater site that were first-time things for Canada and also sort of entered the mythology of cutting-edge archaeology for underwater sites in North America. One of the things that was developed by one of the members of the Marine Archaeology Unit at Parks was this system of warm water flowing through our suits. Having the warm water flow through increased the amount of time one could stay underwater by many, many factors.
Throughout the underwater archaeological excavation, they very meticulously documented the specific location of every timber and every artifact found on the site.
There were smaller items that came from the wreck as well. Ceramic vessels, for instance. Things like walnuts. Walnuts are a very common food in the Basque country, still are. And so we had some insight into what they were eating. There was shoe leather fragments, meters and meters of rope, hemp rope. A compass housing was found.
The compass housing, called a binnacle, is a wooden cabinet that protected the compass, a crucial navigation tool that helped ensure the ship was heading in the right direction.
Seeing these items underwater during our many dives, it was always very stimulating. There was always an awareness with every swish of your hand as you moved dirt from rope line or timber, something could emerge that was fascinating.
For example,
it was a clear, sunny day, which wasn't very frequent in Red Bay. The rays of the sun seemed to hit the water in a way and come to the bottom in a certain way. And as I was getting ready to go to the surface, I noticed something on a ship's timber. I swam over and realized that it was an etching of probably that very vessel that a Basque whaler had carved into the side of the ship.
One of the Basque whalers had drawn his work site, the galleon. This remarkably detailed etching depicts the ship at anchor, complete with masts, rigging, and anchor lines, plus a chalupa moored to it. A piece of graffiti at the moment the whaler etched it. 400 years later, this artwork is a rare glimpse of a 16th century ship as seen through the eyes of someone who knew it well.
Quite an exciting moment of my time there.
After spending hundreds of years in the cold, salty ocean, a wooden object like the etched timber requires conservation work to avoid deterioration.
So any wood that comes up out of the water, you don't want to allow it to dry out because the water within the cells is really maintaining the structure of the wood. If the water has a chance to dry out, evaporate, it can actually become very fragile and can shrink. Any artifacts that come out of the water, we put them right back into either a tub of water or wrap them up so that that water stays within the wood.
We use sphagnum moss to keep the objects wet during transportation. The team had turned an old fish merchant's warehouse into a field lab.
Cindy's first job with Parks Canada was working in this makeshift lab, helping to catalog the finds.
The bottom floor of that was just covered with tanks, holding tanks.
The objects in those tanks were treated by a team of Parks Canada conservators. Many artifacts have since returned to Red Bay for public display, including one vessel small enough to conserve in its entirety. During the excavation of the presumed San Juan wreck site, archaeologists also found several smaller boats, including chalupas.
One of those was raised. So every timber was taken up, brought to the surface, and brought to the conservation labs. It's now actually on display at the visitor center in Red Bay.
The presumed San Juan was in remarkably good condition for a 400-year-old shipwreck, but it was too big and too fragile to be raised to the surface in one piece.
Conservation of wooden objects is very time-consuming. So taking that into consideration, they decided that they would try to rebury the entire shipwreck. The environment that the ship was found in is actually very good for conservation. Very cold, it's dark.
It'll remain protected beneath the waves and also beneath a geomembrane, which looks like an enormous black tarp.
The geomembrane that we use, they're actually created for tailing ponds. They're impermeable. They're very durable, very thick.
The geomembrane creates an anaerobic environment.
So if we can create an environment where there's no oxygen, that limits the type of organisms that can live there. But if we put enough sand and then a non-permeable covering over top of that, the wood will actually last another several hundred years. And our job every 5 years when we go back is to make sure that that reburial mound that they created is still in good condition.
As you can imagine, the seasonal influx of researchers had quite an effect on Red Bay, which had a population of 365 people back in 1981.
There was a concerted effort to involve community families and their children to work on the site. Our cooks were women from Red Bay who kept us quite happy, baking the world's most wonderful bread. You can't imagine how delicious their bread was. There are many ways of feeling welcomed, and we certainly experienced some lovely ones.
Cindy Gibbons was growing up in Red Bay at this time.
Having these researchers around was part of our life. Some of my earliest memories are this site being explored and discovered, and Selma Barkham trekking through our front garden with trowels. And apparently, the day after I saw them poking around our front yard, I took spoons from my mother's kitchen and I went and started digging my own holes. I don't really have a recollection of that, but apparently I did that. Kind of got me hooked. I started working with Parks Canada underwater archaeology when I was still in high school. And it really shaped my life.
The archaeological work had a big impact really on the town. They hired some local students and some men to manage equipment on the barge that was anchored over the ship.
It helped a lot of my generation. Not necessarily that we all became involved in history and archaeology. Some of us did. But just the fact that we figured out through all these people who were coming every year that there was a world outside and there were opportunities.
In 2013, UNESCO recognized the Red Bay Basque Whaling Station as a World Heritage Site.
World Heritage recognizes that a site is important on the world stage. It's important to human history overall. Not just to the people who live at the site or even just to the people of Canada, it's important to the world.
This site has provided us with so much information about Basque shipbuilding that we didn't have before. And if we don't take care of these sites, we just won't have access to that anymore. It's a limited resource of knowledge.
The designation came because it's a really good and well-preserved example of early industrial scale whaling. And really, that started in southern Labrador with the Basques.
Cindy watched the UNESCO announcement at the local school along with many residents of Red Bay.
It was amazing. Probably about 50 people in the room at 7 o'clock in the morning.
In a town with a population of 142, according to the 2021 census, that's a lot of people.
That really brought home the sense of commitment that the town of Red Bay and its residents has towards this site.
None of this would have happened were it not for Selma Barkham. Without her spirit and determination, there would never have been a test pit dug on the land site, let alone a diver go down in Red Bay Harbour. Most of what we know about the economics of whaling, about the number of men on these vessels, the amount of oil that was brought back from Red Bay to the Basque Country, the merchants involved, the lawsuits that took place, This rich, multifaceted picture that we have of Red Bay is through her research largely, continued by her son, Michael Barkham.
When you're walking on Saddle Island, there were people there in the 1560s actually doing this job and actually whaling and rendering oil right there where you're standing. And you can still see a lot of the clay tiles along the shorelines, or you can still see the holes where the try-works were.
Red Bay National Historic Site is open to the public daily from early June to early October. Stop by to see the redeveloped visitor center with new exhibits and original Basque artifacts like leather shoes, barrels, a harpoon head, and an astrolabe. There's also the restored chalupa used by the whalers. Take a boat ride to Saddle Island to walk the interpretive trail with stunning views of the harbor and see for yourself the site of North America's first oil boom, with archaeological sites like rendering ovens and the final resting place of the presumed San Juan. Red Bay, Labrador is an hour drive from Blanc-Sablon, Quebec, which has a regional airport and a ferry terminal for travel from northern Newfoundland. If you're up for an extended road trip, the drive from Montreal is around 27 hours. There's also a collection of Basque whaling artifacts on display at the Rooms Provincial Museum in St. John's, Newfoundland. ReCollections is produced by Parks Canada. Thanks to our consulting producer for this episode, Dr. Michael Barkham. A big thank you to Dr. Marianne Stopp, Cindy Gibbons, Brandy Lockhart, John Higdon, Dr. Megan Jack, Kirby Ryan, and Philip Bridle. Selma Barkham was recognized with many awards in the years following her discoveries, including the Order of Canada, for uncovering a period in Canadian history about which almost nothing was known. Selma passed away in 2020. Archaeologist Dr. Jim Tuck had a formidable career as a field researcher and teacher who inspired thousands of students at Memorial University and in the community of Red Bay. He passed away in 2019. Robert Grenier was the head of Parks Canada's underwater archaeology team during the Red Bay excavations and for many years after. As the committee stated when he was named an Officer of the Order of Canada in 2004, the innovative methods he developed made the Red Bay site an international model for scientific research. For loads of extras, including a Google Arts and Culture exhibition with photos of the site and artifacts, take a look at the show notes or visit parks.canada.ca/recollections. I'm your host, Fred Shepard. Thanks for listening. Did you know that the designation of many of Canada's national historic sites, people, and events began with a suggestion from the public? If you have a suggestion, check out the show notes or visit parks.canada.ca/commemorate for information on how to nominate a new event, person, or site that's important to the history of Canada.